I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm outside of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is the newest Smithsonian museum about the African American experience here in the United States. It just opened in 2016. I'm really excited to see what they did with this. I saw this building while it was under construction in 2016. It's a bit unusual architecture, but I do like it. Also, it has been really popular, which is a good thing, but you actually need a timed ticket to get in because it's so popular, and I had to make the arrangements for that ticket 6 months ago with my senator. That's how difficult it was to get in. But we're going. As Bill right next to the Washington Monument, the monument to our nation's founder, but who is also a slave owner.
The building has a thin layer of scrim along it, which is patterned off historical iron grills built by African Americans in Charleston and New Orleans. That is by Chikaya Booker, who makes her art out of tire remnants. The main museum exhibits are underground. They take you down in an elevator and you walk through history chronologically, starting with the transatlantic slave trade starting in the 15th century. Africa and Europe had traded in past centuries, but beginning now with the discovery of the New World, they began trading humans for labor in the Americas, especially when they found out that the native people they tried to enslave in the Americas mostly died out due to diseases. These are artifacts related to the slave trade. The first Africans arrived in what is now the US at Jamestown in 1619. These are genuine shackles from Africa. Often tribal rulers would trade their own people to the Europeans for goods. The slave ships were horrendous. They would often crowd 200 Africans onto a small ship to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean, give them little water, clothing, food, or time above deck. This old book shows a diagram of what these ships look like. A lot of artifacts here are just painful to see. Like this is a used slave whip. These are relics from the São José, which was a Portuguese slave ship that sank in 1794 on the way to Brazil, drowning 200 slaves with it. These are slave shackles used in the Chesapeake area, where slaves and indentured servants began working the tobacco plantations. Many European powers got involved in the slave trade, not just Spain and Great Britain. These are relics from Bacon's Rebellion, which was an uprising of poor Westerners in Virginia that included black indentured servants along with whites. These are artifacts of 18th century slavery in the United States, which existed even in northern areas at the time, but mostly in the southern colonies. During this time, the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina was the largest before the Revolution. It involved 100 enslaved people marching with drums and a banner that read "Liberty." The slaves on colonial plantations were treated horribly, virtually had no rights, and there were very few free blacks in the British colonies. In 1729, the Natchez Indians started fighting the French and promised freedom to all blacks who joined. About 5,000 African Americans enlisted and fought in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Many also joined on the Loyalist side. Both had incentives by owners for freedom if they did so, but many were still enslaved after service. This powder keg was used by Prince Simbo, who joined in the Continental Army, fought bravely and was wounded and was freed for it. This sculpture is awesome. It's called the Paradox of Liberty, with statues of some influential people around 1776. including Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but himself was a slave owner, owning over 600 humans during his lifetime. And this is Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the successful Haitian Revolution against France and freeing Haiti for a time from colonial influence. This is a letter written by him. These are the Cabildo records by a Spanish governor of Louisiana that recorded his mixed reaction about the Haitian Revolution. This is Elizabeth Freeman, one of the first to successfully sue and win her freedom in court. And this is some jewelry that Freeman made and gifted to the daughter of her attorney. This is poet Phyllis Wheatley, who became very famous around the American Revolution for her works. Despite being a household name, she still could never get out of poverty. And this is Benjamin Banneker, an African American who knew Jefferson and had correspondence with him, often challenging his views on Africans and slavery. Here's a copy of the Constitution, which did not include or give freedom to African Americans. In fact, it included slavery in some parts, like the 3/5 Compromise. Now we get into the 19th century, and cotton became king in many areas of the South with the invention of the cotton gin. This is Nat Turner's Bible. He led a violent uprising of slaves that killed 55 white people, but ended with the execution of about 200 blacks. That is a brick from the Whitehead Plantation, one of the plantations Nat Turner raided. These are advertisements of slave auctions that were held in many major cities. This red flag signaled that slaves were ready to be sold at the Charleston Slave Mart, and that is a genuine auction block from which people were humiliated, separated from their family forever, and sold off into slavery. This is Ashley's sack that a mother gave to her daughter before being sold off into slavery. Importing slaves from Africa was made illegal in 1807. As the 19th century continued, more and more people, mainly in the North, began openly opposing slavery and demanding its abolition. It was becoming a top political issue that the founders purposely avoided. Henry Clay tried to balance this issue with the 1820 Missouri Compromise, and later the last-ditch effort of the 1850 Compromise, which included the Fugitive Slave Act. Sojourner Truth was an escaped slave, was the first to successfully sue for someone else's freedom, and became an outspoken abolitionist and women's rights advocate. This is Harriet Tubman's lace shawl, given to her by Queen Victoria of England. She made 19 trips back to the South to free about 300 slaves. This is a hymnal book of hers. She was very spiritual, and she used this specific book a lot throughout her life. This is a genuine slave cabin built in 1853 from the Point of Pines plantation in Edisto Island, South Carolina. Slaves were forced to live in bad conditions, often very tightly packed together, in the shadow of the grand plantation home of their white master. Think about it, so many important buildings, and really the original infrastructure of the country was built by slaves. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, an emotional story about slavery that was widely read in the US and England and increased support for abolitionism. This map was in the breast pocket of Free Soil advocate David Hogg, who was killed by a pro-slavery mob in Kansas. It is blood-stained. That is William Lloyd Garrison's pocket watch. He was one of the most popular abolitionists before the Civil War and published the Anti-Slavery Liberator newspaper. A copy of the North Star, a newspaper founded by escaped slave Frederick Douglass in 1847. Somewhat anti-slavery, Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. In reaction, southern states began seceding and eventually formed the Confederate States of America, and the Civil War began, the bloodiest conflict in American history. About 200,000 African Americans served, usually in the Union Army, but some blacks were forced into the Confederate Army, and 40,000 killed in the conflict. These are artifacts of the brave men who served in segregated units in hopes for freedom and equality at the end of the war. That is the pen used by President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, and an inkwell he used during the presidency. Next to it is the cane of Frederick Douglass, who knew Lincoln and became a famous African American and women's rights advocate after the Civil War. In 1865, the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was passed abolishing slavery, but President Lincoln was assassinated and Southern Democrat Andrew Johnson was president, but Republicans held a supermajority in Congress. Hiram Revels was the first African American to be elected to the Senate from Mississippi in 1870, and Robert Smalls of South Carolina was elected to the House of Representatives the same year. Free African American towns began. This home was the first in Jonesville, Maryland, which was one of those towns. It is really neat to see how they moved some historic structures into the museum. It was built in 1875, and these towns were a step towards freedom and independence and being self-made people. Many developed out west, like Nicodemus in Kansas. Reconstruction didn't go well for African Americans. Whites in the South began gaining more power again, former slaves turned into sharecroppers, which wasn't much different, and a whole new segregated society was created in all areas of the country. Racism and negative stereotypes were still prevalent, as seen here. And the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization that somehow still exists, first became popular and started threatening, antagonizing, and lynching African Americans. In 1896, the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that things were separate but equal, but the equal part was never enforced. This is a segregated water fountain, clearly poor quality and not equal to the white fountain. Lynchings of blacks was essentially legalized, and in the South and in the North, almost 3,500 African Americans were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Ida B. Wells Barnett was an investigative journalist and writer who wrote and recorded all the lynchings that were happening in the late 19th and earliest 20th century and led a crusade against that. African Americans started their own artistic movements and styles, like ragtime music, and the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar was recognized internationally. I've been to his home. That is a pew from the oldest black congregation in Chicago. After the Civil War, Harriet Tubman founded a home for poor and elderly African Americans. Black feminist groups began forming, advancing the societal role of double minorities. Here's an old organ. From ragtime, styles moved on to jazz and blues, which became a basis for most popular music genres that have developed since then. A clock from the oldest African American bank in the country. Madam C.J. Walker of Indianapolis became the first African American and woman millionaire for her beauty products. Again, with Jim Crow and little industry in the South, a lot of African Americans became sharecroppers or impoverished farmers. Loretta Pemberton's wedding dress. Over 350,000 African Americans served in World War I. They were still in segregated units or fought with the French. This is a KKK Grand Dragon costume. In the early 20th century, the Klan became prevalent even in the North. A painting by Jacob Lawrence, an early African American artist, depicting the Great Migration from the South to the North. That is Marcus Garvey's hat. He became popular supporting Pan-Africanism, which was moving back to Africa and economic and political solidarity with Africans worldwide, a basis for some of the more militant groups later on. That is a Quran of Muhammad Elijah, who led the Nation of Islam, which throughout the mid-20th century appealed to a lot of African Americans to return to Islam and support self-independence. A Father Divine banner and chair from the Spruce Street Baptist Church in Nashville. Those were both black charity groups. And this is a piece of rope used to lynch Matthew Williams in Maryland in 1931. A dress worn by a resident of Rosewood, Florida, where a 1923 massacre of blacks and destruction of the town occurred. Tuskegee Airmen artifacts, 125,000 African Americans served overseas in World War II. Segregation was everywhere. Businesses from restaurants to railroads, the public utilities were all segregated. To travel, they would have to use a green book to find safe places. Here's some artifacts of segregation that blacks had to deal with for a century. Parts of a Citizens Committee van from the 1950s. That is the Brown v. Board of Education decision paper in which the Supreme Court ruled schools should not be segregated. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall was appointed the first African-American Supreme Court Justice. Before, he had been a lawyer arguing civil rights cases like Brown v. Board of Education, and that is his robe. Rosa Parks was sewing this dress on the day she refused to give up her seat on a segregated Montgomery bus and was arrested, beginning the Freedom Rides movement. After that, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., planned more challenges to segregation, like protests and leadership training. Carlotta Lanier was the youngest of the Little Rock Nine at age 14, and this is the dress she wore on the day she was refused entry to Little Rock High School by the National Guard. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee artifacts, they led freedom rides and voter registration at the time. This is a chair from Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, where in 1960 some of the earliest sit-ins occurred, which was an early success in the civil rights movement. The Congress of Racial Equality was another major organization doing protests for equality. A pocket watch of Bayard Rustin, a gay civil rights strategist who helped Martin Luther King Jr. a lot, but troubled a lot of civil rights leaders because he was gay. This is tragic. This is shattered stained glass from the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where a terrorist bombed in 1963 and killed 4 young girls. That is the pen used by President Lyndon Johnson to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed discrimination. Malcolm X was a brilliant orator who was with the Nation of Islam for a while, then split before being assassinated in 1965. Black Power, which was used by more anti-integration and militant people, was a phrase and ideology, and this is a self-defense rifle used by the Black Panthers, a group which supported this ideology. That is the pen used by LBJ to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed voting discrimination, which still sometimes happens, unfortunately. Representative John Lewis was a civil rights leader in the 60s who was nearly beaten to death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and got the law passed for the authorization of this museum. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the best known civil rights leader and martyr. He used this tub to soak his feet after the Selma to Montgomery March, which he bravely led. And that's a congressional medal bestowed to him and his wife Coretta Scott King. This is a unique honor. And probably the most tragic artifact is the casket of Emmett Till. Unfortunately, I was not able to record it. They said the family requested that, which I think is contrary to the idea of the original point of the casket, to show the world the cruelty and the tragedy of it, but I didn't sneak anything like I usually try to do out of respect. He was a young black boy from Chicago who in 1955, at age 14, went to visit family in the Mississippi Delta, where some white men accused him of whistling at a white woman, and a few days later they abducted him from his great-uncle's home and brutally beat him and mutilated him, and then shot him in the head and drowned his body into a river, where it was discovered a few days later. His mother insisted on a public and publicized funeral with the open casket to show his face, to show the racism and evil that was so rampant throughout the country, did to a 14-year-old child. In 2005, the casket was removed for DNA analysis to confirm his body, and this casket was discovered rotting in a shed 4 years later, and the Smithsonian got a hold of it. At the museum, I waited in a 15-minute line, and you walk by the casket just as over 10,000 people did at his funeral, and that was extremely emotional. It is one of the most moving and haunting experiences of my life. This is an old guard tower from the Angola, Louisiana prison, which was for a long time the worst and bloodiest prison in the country. This is a segregated train car from 1923. I didn't have time to wait in line and go inside. That is a Stearman Cadet, which was used as a trainer by the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the first African American aviators in the armed forces, even though they still had to deal with lots of discrimination. Now this is incredible. This is a banner from the Poor People's Campaign, which was started in 1968 by Martin Luther King Jr. right before its assassination to alleviate poverty for all Americans. Unfortunately, he did not live to see this through. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a sniper at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Malcolm X, who was also assassinated, did push different methods than King, but his legacy still lives on as well. After 1968, black nationalist movements were still popular into the 70s, like the Black Panthers, who were against the Vietnam War. Due to economic reasons and racism as well, less African Americans could get into college, and therefore student deferments from the draft, so over 20% of the men sent to die in Vietnam were African Americans, even though they made up 10% of the population. Here's a button from the Black Political Convention, which was held in Gary, Indiana in 1972. The civil rights movement has inspired other ethnic minorities like Latinos and others who suffer from institutional disadvantages. There's Oprah's dress, and it's set from her very popular talk show. In this, she often returned to a theme of self-empowerment. Public Enemy was a popular hip-hop group. Unfortunately, racism still exists in this country. Recently, attention has been brought to the Black Lives Matter movement due to police shootings of unarmed black men, which has been happening a lot. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected the first African American president. There is one of Michelle Obama's dresses. And that is the main history gallery, absolutely incredible. At this point, the museum was about to close and I was panicking, and I forgot to go in here, the contemplative court with an inside waterfall. That's one of the highlights of the museum. I'm still really upset I forgot to come in here and miss this. I bolted up to the top floor. The upper floors are about black culture, which will be cool to see. I think they have Chuck Berry's Cadillac and stuff like that.
Alright, that museum was amazing. I can't describe how awesome that was. They did such a good job on it, and the Emmett Till part that I couldn't show you, his casket, that one's brought me to tears. But anyways, I have other videos here in DC, so go check those out, and thanks for watching.